Services Marketing, Part 5. Here are the learning outcomes for this section. We'll look into service failure and also look at the processes of service recovery. Before we do that, let's recap on Part 4. In Part 4, we looked at how service quality is conceptualized and measured. We regarded service quality as a complex construct and looked at it through the Parasureman et al. Model. We saw that quality perceptions are subjective for each customer within a service encounter, and we looked at how service quality is measured using the gaps between expectations and perceptions among customers. What we're really doing in this final section is we're thinking about what steps do we take from understanding service as a model, like we did in Part 4, breaking it down into different pieces, to actually understanding the delivery of service quality in context and how that relates to service experience. So we're going to see that in real life, things go wrong and problems need to be rectified. Hilton International is an example of this. Their internal focus is on excellent service, and they say delivering the brand experience is the principal marketing tool we have and is the beginning and end of what we do. And they designed a service blueprint which outlines what they call, quote, the ideal guest experience. And what do you think the department in charge of designing that service blueprint was? It was the marketing department. So that department has outlined the requirements for recruitment, training and development, and they monitor and evaluate service delivery levels throughout the organisation, and they will then address issues of service failure and design recovery processes, which is what we're going to look at in this section. This is an example of a service blueprint or a customer journey map for a pharmacist. Now, I'm not going to focus on it too much because we'll cover it in class, and we'll also cover customer journeys in the customer relationship marketing topic later on in the semester. But what you can see is that the timeline, the actions, the roles of different members of the performance of service are outlined, and they're trying to predict how people will react, what people will do, when they will do it, in order to manage the process and ensure or try to minimize the amount of failures that take place. Service inputs and outcomes. Now, using the gap model that we looked at in the last section, you arrive at 5 different dimensions of service quality as Parasureman and colleagues identified. So certain service inputs such as tangibles, responsiveness, i.e. how quick and efficient is something, courtesy, is it polite, friendly, considerate, sincere, communication, do people take time to listen and explain, and competence, knowledge or skills and training. These service inputs result in key service outputs which consumers use to evaluate a service encounter. So you have tangibles, which is the physical evidence, things like price, place and promotion from our marketing 4Ps marketing mix. Responsiveness, that relates to people and processes. Courtesy, that relates to people directly. Communication, which relates to promotion, people and processes. And competence, which relates to people and processes. So these are all combinations of the marketing mix elements which we know and understand. So once you've put in the service inputs, you achieve service outcomes. So we want services to be accessible, i.e. easy to use, where it's clear that our needs are understood and they're reliably catered for. So the expected standards are being met and they're credible in terms of being trustworthy, believable and secure. So going down this list of service outcomes, we see access, meaning the service is easy to use. Understanding the customer is to do with empathy and sincerity. Do we feel as though the way in which the service is being delivered is sincerely attending to the needs that the provider recognizes we have. Reliability, does it meet the standards and does it do so consistently? Credibility, do we trust the brand or the image, or if there are service guarantees, for example, are they followed through on? And security, we should feel as though there is a minimal risk, or risk is managed and taken care of, and that we are safe when we are in the environment. So when we put those together, we see service inputs on the left and the service outcomes on the right, and how those different parts might correspond to outcomes either on the positive side of those outcomes or the negative. But if we put back in the gaps that we considered in part 4, we had gap 1, which was service provider's misconception of the customer, gap 2, inadequate resources, gap 3, inadequate or inconsistent service delivery, gap 4, exaggerated promises, and gap 5, jumping to conclusions. We can see how those gaps relate to service inputs and service outcomes. Now if we return to that model, we remind ourselves that in the center of the model was the service experience. So that encounter that takes place that we understand to be the service experience results in really one of two overall outcomes. Either the customer is satisfied or dissatisfied. And given that we've already discussed how complex the whole process is, and that looking at the research, we can see that a disconfirmation paradigm is used to determine service quality, it's evident that the system is geared towards expecting some form of dissatisfaction on occasions. Therefore, those who are responsible for delivering services marketing need to see failure as part of the system that they manage, and they need to have effective strategies built in to design a mitigation process for occasions when failure does occur. Therefore, we should A, consider failure in the service delivery process as part of the system, and B, look to build in processes that recover from inevitable failure, rather than assuming we'll get it right every time and then operating in denial of the potential for service failure. And service failure happens because of the variability of services. We've got the participation of the customer as the co-producer and the simultaneous nature of service production and consumption, as we've discussed. So despite good planning, as service blueprints would show us that good planning does exist, service failures cannot be prevented. You see on the slide, service failure is inevitable. So we have to anticipate that service will occur and build in measures to recover from it. So what kind of measures do we build in? Well, if we have a system process failure, in these cases a link between the process of delivery and the staff delivering the service somehow breaks down. It could be a maintenance issue like a ride at a theme park being closed, or a key facility needing to be temporarily shut down, like say a swimming pool at a leisure centre. System or process failures are about critical failures in the fundamental delivery of the service. It could be longer queues at the airport or your food being undercooked in a restaurant, but these demonstrate that the system somehow isn't working the way it's meant to. Then we have response failures. These are when the customer has engaged in the service process and has either explicitly or implicitly asked something specifically of the service provider. For example, making a request for a higher floor in a hotel to avoid traffic noise, or a lower floor to avoid having to use the elevator. These are examples of explicit requests. Implicit requests can be difficult to navigate and may involve the behavior of other customers, like the quiet carriage of a train having children. Some people may consider children to be inherently noisy and therefore would not expect children to be allowed in the quiet carriage. Thus they might complain if children are present. There are also failures in the way a service can deal with emergent requests from a customer, such as when we forget our passwords for our banking or our PIN. Although that is technically our fault, the service must have the capacity to support us if we run into difficulty and signpost us towards a resolution. So some of the requests we make as customers are also passive requests through our behaviour rather than active requests based on our wants or expectations. Finally, we have relationship or human failures. This is where the service fails based on the behaviour of employees. These can be unexpected or non-standard behaviours from staff members that are not conforming to service delivery standard operating procedures. Or they might just lack sincerity, empathy, or a basic understanding of the situation. When these failures occur, that is when service recovery kicks into action. So service recovery is concerned with an organization's systematic attempt to correct a problem following service failure. And that is aimed at retaining the customer's goodwill. And they need to do that by acting quickly, demonstrating empathy with the customer's perception of the failure. Remember, we've talked about perceptions before. And enabling employees to instigate corrective actions and award appropriate compensation. Well-managed organizations are able to overcome service failure and develop positive reputations despite the fact failure has taken place. And we'll talk more about service recovery processes in class, but needless to say that when we've accepted that failure is inevitable, organizations that allocate a reasonable amount of resources towards understanding and proactively dealing with service recovery tend to do well. So if we return to our model, we've got the center of the original diagram, which contains the service experience between service delivery and perceived service, and that results in one of two things: satisfaction or dissatisfaction. If we're discussing dissatisfaction, then that means that some form of service failure has occurred, and satisfaction is currently not something the organization is able to achieve because they have found themselves in the dissatisfaction zone. And therefore, they need to introduce a form of service recovery to try and get them out of the dissatisfaction zone. And that usually means a rework, some reworking of the normal processes that are delivered in order to try and move back from the failure. So that rework, represented by service recovery, can move the customer from that point of dissatisfaction through service recovery into the satisfaction zone where they are now happy. And we will talk about this in class as well. There is a phenomenon known as the service recovery paradox, which is where by going through the process that you see on the screen here, some customers actually end up more satisfied than they ever could have been had they been satisfied originally. So by being dissatisfied, experiencing the service recovery rework, and then achieving satisfaction, that level of satisfaction is actually higher. And that's known as the service recovery paradox. And you may have experienced something like that yourself in a restaurant or on holiday where something went wrong and the lengths the organization went to in order to recover from it actually created an experience in its own right that you remember and you want to share. In summary, in this section we've looked at how service quality can be mapped onto a service blueprint. We've seen that service systems have multiple inputs and multiple outcomes. We've conceived of service failure as an inevitable part of the service delivery system. We've seen how service failure can be system-based, response-based, or personnel-based. We've looked at service recovery and how it is designed to retain customer goodwill. And we've seen that service recovery can achieve or even improve customer satisfaction. That is the services marketing topic complete. You've now watched all the content relating to this topic. Please now refer to the course reading for further learning materials.